And by that you mean a dictator,
Well, I don't
like,
think he'd put it in those terms.
but
But it does strike me that it's a very, it's not a sensible option for somebody to take. It would be far more sensible to wait until the next presidential term, or maybe never, because as Minister of Defense in a country where the military is extremely popular, um, there wouldn't be any need. Indeed.
in terms of his popularity, I mean, we've seen these new anti-protest laws, which make it impossible for protesters to gather in groups larger than 10. If my understanding of the law is correct, this is what our friend Ahmed Mar was arrested for with his associates, and is still in detention. We had the incident where all of those young girls, right? We talked about this a little earlier, were sentenced to long sentences. They were given 11 years in prison, and eventually those sentences were reduced on appeal, but that sparked an international outcry. We have the incident in Rabat, where hundreds of protesters are gunned down by the military in the deadliest,
By the police. By the
by the
police.
police, by the police. So, I mean, you know, the people don't see that. It doesn't damage his credibility. It doesn't damage his popularity.
No, not really. And you have to keep in mind that the way in which the narrative has been constructed in Egypt for the past 5 months has been very one-sided. I'm not saying that the other side has the correct narrative. I don't think they do. And if you look at Muslim Brotherhood sources and official state sources, you see two very different universes, but they're also both quite different from the universe that I think we actually all live in. And this is a great problem that you have in trying to understand what happens in Egypt. And that's a problem for people who live inside of Egypt, let alone outside of it. So when you have the clearing of the sit-ins in Rabaa, for example, you have 6 weeks beforehand where the national media has made it very clear that the people who are in Rabaa are essentially creating a terrorist insurgency from within Cairo. Okay, um, now it's a claim that I don't take particularly seriously because were that the case, if it was such a horrible, despicable place, I doubt very much that the police and the army would have left it alone and not at least try to stop people from going in and out. They did not do that, and I remember going myself to just see what it was, and I entered and left without any security applied upon me whatsoever. So you can't have it both ways. It can't be a terrorist insurgency, which you leave alone for 6 weeks. Okay, if it's terrorist, then you have to take it. If it's not, then you don't. But for that 6 week period, you have that rhetoric constantly being drummed in. So when actually the clearing of the sit-ins takes place on August 14th, there and in Nahda was very different though. You didn't have the same public outcry that I would have imagined would have been the case, precisely because many Egyptians really did think that it was a terrorist stronghold, and that the army would never allow such a sit-in, such a clearing to take place unless indeed it was a threat to national security. Now, this was above and beyond the objections even within the cabinet, particularly from the vice president, Mohammed al-Baradei, who resigned as a result, and also the deputy prime minister, Ziyad Bahaddin, and maybe one or two others. But generally, people followed the line of the interior minister, who insisted that it had to be cleared. It doesn't create that much of an uproar precisely because you've had this rhetoric drummed in for so long over that 6 week period, and also the result of seeing how the Brotherhood had been in power for the year before. When you talk about the protests, this is something that, again, people that I know back in Egypt from the activist community, they're convinced that protests aren't actually as unpopular as they are. I think now people have sort of woken up to that, but actually protests haven't been popular in Egypt since 2011, February 12th. Okay? From February 12th onwards, you have an overwhelming majority of the Egyptian population, anything from 88 to 92%, that constantly said continued protests are a bad idea. Okay, so that combined with the fact that the protests are actually by Brotherhood supporters makes for a very unpopular protest indeed. But it also means that when non-Islamist protesters go out, they don't necessarily get a huge majority of the population by far supporting them. I should say something about the young ladies that you mentioned. They weren't actually held on the protest law. They were held through other laws that exist within the Egyptian legal system. They didn't need the protest law to do something like that. That's the state of the judicial system.
And so let's just talk briefly about the new constitution and about the upcoming elections, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. But we have a new constitution, and a lot of people are criticizing it. It would still allow for military trials, etc. Tell us a little bit about the new constitution and what your thoughts about it are.
Well, two things. First of all, it's a pretty lousy constitution. Secondly, it will pass. I have no doubt about that. It's lousy because, personally, I think it doesn't pay tribute to the sacrifices that have been paid in blood over the past 3 years in Egypt. It's probably marginally better than the 2012 constitution. I don't think that's much of an accomplishment because that one was truly awful. It does allow for military trials of civilians, albeit in somewhat more restricted fashion than the 2012 constitution, but they're still allowed. It's not a document that I think is really suitable for a post 2011 Egypt. But having said that, it will pass. I have very little doubt about that, because it won't be a referendum on the constitution. It will be a referendum on the ouster of Mohammed Morsi. And a no vote will generally be taken as an expression of opposition to that, and that's actually what the yes vote camp is pushing for right now. And a yes vote will be an expression of support for the military, for the June 30th revolution, and I think that it will pass. Now, that isn't necessarily a huge victory for the interim government. A huge victory for the interim government is if turnout is higher than what it was in 2012, and if the percentage of yes votes is also higher than what it was in 2012. If they don't meet those two criteria, then I suspect they won't consider it to be a victory, but they'll have to spin it as well as they can. Right now, the interim government is taking any steps that they can in order to increase the chances of people going out to vote. I don't think they have anything to worry about in terms of it being free. Because I think it will be a free vote. I don't think it'll be fair because I can't imagine that there'll be much television space, for example, pushing for a no vote. But I do know that the Ministry of Justice at present is apparently considering allowing for a vote to take place anywhere in the country, so citizens would not have to go to their constituency in order to vote. They could vote anywhere in the country. That's something that has not been seen actually since 2011. And that was for the first referendum. So that'll make it easier for people to vote, and I think that they will push as hard as possible to get people out on the streets, and I think it'll pass.
Okay, great. Well, listen, while we still have a few minutes, let me just ask if there's anybody in the audience that would like to ask Dr. Hellyer a question. This gentleman, Sharif Mansour, who is Sharif is a friend of my good friend Robert Becker, and Sharif was a part of the famous NGO trial where you were working for the National Democratic Institute in Cairo, and they all were convicted and sentenced, and my good friend Robert Becker had to go into exile and is currently living in Nigeria and couldn't be with us today, but he sends you his regards, Sharif. So do we want to pass the microphone to Mr. Mansour? And he can ask Dr. Hellyer a question.
Thank you very much. This was very insightful, and I really think it was important for a lot of the audience here who may not be familiar with the situation in Egypt. I will start my question basically from the last comment you made about the next referendum, and that's the choice in any election that I feel and a lot of Egyptians feel is always between the former regime, the military on one side, and the Brotherhood or their allies on the other. We feel like we're stuck in this equation, and because there isn't a strong third alternative that could have electoral sizable electoral wins in any election. My question is, what are the potential of this happening in the near future? And from what you've seen, could we see a really strong secular or non-religious opposition playing that role in the near future?
Well, thank you, Sharif. It's a good question, and I'm glad that you changed from secular to non-religious, because the concept of secular in a country like Egypt is very different, I think, than what people might imagine. I tend to use the term non-Islamist in order to make things specific, but you raise a very interesting point that there are huge forces rallying behind the military. You also have many sources rallying behind the Muslim Brotherhood, although I think that they are far outnumbered by those who support the military. I would say probably around 5% of the population, maybe a little bit more if I'm being charitable, back neither one and would support another option. The problem is that they have never, in the past 3 years, been able to turn that base of support into a genuine political alternative. And this is a frequent discussion that activists back in Egypt have, where the protest is no longer a tactic, it's a strategy. And a protest can never be a strategy. A protest can be a tactic, but it can never be a strategy, because it can't fulfill anything on its own. There has to be some sort of connection to a political platform and program and group that can then lobby accordingly and be voted into parliament or put forward a presidential candidate and so on. And what we saw very clearly in round one of the presidential elections in 2012 was that the non-military, non-brotherhood vote was split. And as a result became inconsequential. I don't know if we should be waiting in the future for that group to finally get its act together, because we may never see that happening. But what I do know is that this current situation is unsustainable. The same issues that drove people to the streets time and time again over the past 3 years remain. Economic reform is nowhere on the horizon, and that will drive people to the streets. Security sector reform is nowhere on the horizon, and as the security apparatus begins to target those who are further and further away from the Islamist sector, I think it will become more and more unpopular. It's not a sustainable situation at all. The worry that I have is what price Egypt will pay as a result of, yet again, the lack of insight from its political elite. They've shown time and time again that they are behind their population, far behind, and have not been able to provide or meet the expectations, even in a small way, of those that actually believe in a better future for Egypt. So I'm not saying that's good news or bad news. I'm saying that this cannot continue. And it will be down to those who govern in Egypt to take steps to minimize the explosion that inevitably is going to have to take place. And I hope it provides a bit of a wake-up call to those who believe in genuine reform and genuinely a better future for Egypt that is not dictated by the dictates of the military or the Muslim Brotherhood. And I hope that there will be those that will take up that challenge. A friend of mine, or rather a friend of mine, sent me a message before I came to New York and said, I hope that you're coming to give us some good news, because I personally don't see any light at the end of the tunnel anymore. What I wanted to tell her is that she and others are that light that they're looking for at the end of the tunnel. And if they don't stand up and they don't step up and be counted in this new phase, then they'll have no one else to blame except for themselves.
Great answer. Is there anybody else that would like to ask Dr. Hellyer a question? Yes, Mustafa.
Hi. About the Constitution, I kind of have two questions, but I'm going to try not to hog the mic and ask the simple one. About the Constitution, how do people justify the military trials of civilians? Because one thing that drives me to think is that people like Amr Shobaki, whom the Egyptians in the audience will know, is a very quite a respected political commentator, analyst, professor, who is in the Constitutional Assembly and has endorsed the article about the military trials. So how does a guy like that find it in himself to support it? How do they justify it? Why does it need to exist?
In the same way that for the past decade around the world, the war on terror narrative has allowed and justified all sorts of different permissive attitudes from government. And I think that that's what's playing out very heavily in Egypt at present, where you have a lot of people who really believe that this is a war on terror, and a war on terror that is destabilizing the entire country. Now, the reality is that there is an insurgency, and it's in Sinai. And there are isolated acts of terrorism elsewhere in the country. But the fear that has gripped the majority of the Egyptian population that do back the military is that this is a war on terror. And in that sort of environment, one would want to rally behind the military. And you've seen it from many different political figures and religious figures, mind you, where they view anything less than complete, utter, and uncritical support of the military to be necessary at this point in time for Egypt's future. Otherwise, the country could very well collapse. So that's the rationale. It's not one that I accept, it's not one that I buy, but that is the rationale.
Should I pass it or should I ask?
No, go ahead. Mustafa, do you have another question? Please.
Yes, please. It's more of a more open-ended question. Obviously, the past 3 years have taught us that the Egyptians at large, as much as I believe in them, like you said you do, and I really think they're a loving, exceptional people. But we've learned the past 3 years. We've learned the past 3 years that the Egyptians are not on the same page. Like what caused a lot of this trouble is that Egyptians have different ideas about how things should work out for Egypt or what form of government or whatever. And it dates back, started in the March 2011 referendum that really split the Egyptians, which is very shameful. Do you have an idea, imaginative, creative, practical, whatever, about how Egyptians can somehow come to agreement about how we need to manage to live together and prosper together now and in the future?
My mother has to catch a show. Yeah. Anita Gillette, who, if you don't know who she is, she's a great singer, actress, Anita Gillette. Have fun, Mom. Forgive me.
Not at all. It was a great honor. It's a good question, Mustafa, but it's one that I don't have any good answer for at this particular moment in Egyptian history, precisely because of this war on terror narrative, on the one hand, and the obsession with the zero-sum game by all political forces in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood are playing a zero-sum game. Those that support the military are playing a zero-sum game. And very few people in the past 3 years have realized that Egypt is not only too big, but also too unruly for everybody to win. Sorry, for anybody to win without everybody winning. And I think that's unfortunate because it's resulted in basically a battle of the fittest, right? And as a result, you had a democratic experiment become weakened. You had people die. And I'm afraid I don't see much change in that for the coming few years. And tied very much with this is the economic situation. We're all talking about politics, but unless the economic situation is taken very, very seriously and addressed, then politics will fast become a very secondary priority for all of us. Because if people in Egypt feel that they're going hungry, if they are actually going hungry, that will trump any political consideration, whether brotherhood or otherwise. So we do have a very challenging time ahead of us, and I think that the best time to have addressed that question would have indeed been in March 2011, And I think the military council fumbled the ball completely on that, but I don't think they had any interest in doing otherwise.
We have time for one more question. This lady, yeah, or this gentleman. Okay. Okay, two more questions. We'll have two more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'm Karim Abdullah. I'm a talk show host on the Egyptian National Television. So, first, thank you. This is one of the best analysis I've ever heard about Egypt, and trust me, I've met a lot who claim to be analysts. So, really, this is really one of the best. I have two questions. One is for you. How do you see Baradei, and what's his reactions about what the government did? And I do have a question for Holt. Actually, I'm so much intrigued by how much information do you have for Egypt. Do you have a soft spot for Egypt only, or are you like that for any international affairs?
No, yeah, I definitely have a soft spot for Egypt. You know, my visit to Cairo this year was one of the most wonderful experiences I've ever had in my life. I talked about meeting the family of Jika. I went to the Bulak neighborhood of Cairo, where I met
I work next to Bulak.
You work next to Bulak.
I work in the national television, which is in Bulak.
Okay, so I met the family of a young man named Mohammed Morsi. He happens to have the same name as the ousted president, and a 17-year-old boy who was incarcerated for violating the curfew, taken away from his family. And I got to sit and meet with them, and just the sadness of their situation was very moving to me. And I just I met so many interesting people. Some of them are friends of Sharif Mansour, people like Robert Becker and Ahmed Mar and Hafsa Halawa, a lot of the people that were involved in the NGO trial, and I met Bassem Youssef. I met Hisham Hellyer. I mean, I really had an amazing experience, and the political events in Egypt have been moving so quickly, and there's so much to try to understand, that when the possibility of having Dr. Hellyer come and speak arose, I just said, let's try to make it happen any way that we can.
Thank you.
In answer to your question. It's a good question. I think it's one that I've thought about many times over the last few months, and actually the last few years, because Mohammed al-Baradei has been given certain opportunities of his own. And I don't know if he's always made the right decisions, but one thing that I remain convinced about, and I don't know him, and I generally have a very poor opinion of politicians, but my deepest criticism of Mohammed al-Baradei was that he was never a politician. And he never seemed to grasp the political game. I think he remained sincere. I respect him for his decision. I oppose the vilification of him after he left. He didn't take the opportunity to embarrass Egypt or anything like that in front of the world. He made a decision. He went quietly. It was one that he believed his conscience demanded of him. I don't think that he has a place in Egyptian politics in the future. And I think that he has come to that conclusion himself. Incidentally, he's moving here, and will be here for the foreseeable future. He's taken up a position. He'll be taking up a position at Tufts, and I'm sure he made his mistakes, like many others have made their mistakes within the context of the last 3 years. I think his intentions were good, and I wish him all the best.
We have time for one more question. This lady here.
Hi, I'm Dalia.
Hi, Dalia.
I have a question about the justice system in Egypt. We sit here and we watch TV and we see them as either, non-functioning, bullies. They have all these media attention, the general attorney. I mean, how can a country function with no justice system this way? And what do you see in the future? Then what's going to happen with the justice system in Egypt?
The short answer to your first question is that a country cannot function, actually. Yet another reason why Egypt miraculously seems to survive. And I truly believe that anybody who has doubts about the existence of God only needs to go to Egypt, because logically speaking, this country should not survive. I remember when I was younger, I met a graduate student who was convinced that Egypt was blessed. I said, why? And he said, there is no other country in the world where the guy that pumps gas at the petrol station is a chain smoker on the job and the thing doesn't go up in flames. Plus, I crossed the road. There's a God. Anybody who's been to Egypt and tried to cross the street knows the truth of that statement. There are three major issues that I feel are imperative for any government in Egypt to take stock of. That is the inability of the judiciary to do its job according to the values of any judiciary system, the economic reforms that are necessary and needed, and security sector reform. If these three things were tackled by any politician or any political figure in Egypt, I think they would save Egypt for coming generations. By the same token, as long as those institutions remain unreformed and untackled, the price will be paid for future generations to come. But it's not sustainable. And every time I talk about Egypt, or every time I've talked about Egypt in the last few months, I get people saying, you're awfully pessimistic about Egypt. And the reality is I'm not pessimistic at all. And on the contrary, I find there to be many reasons to be optimistic about the future, but only because things are not sustainable in this fashion. At some point, something's got to give, and I remain a believer in the idea that at some point it will give, and at some point some gains will be gained, and the price of the past few years will still be dear and high, but that the future generations of that country, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, they will remember this period as a difficult one, but one through which Egypt overcame. And Egypt began to build something anew. And people are very pessimistic about that many times. I see a good friend of mine shaking his head right now. But the reality is, you've had a country that has suffered under Hosni Mubarak for 30 years, destroying institutions, and making it very difficult for anything to come out. And I view that as a great wound. And right now I see us having scabs that we're picking at. At some point that heals, and time is a good healer. And again, Egypt is an extremely illogical place. It is not rational that anything could have taken place like this in the last few years. I remember, I'll close on this point. I remember on the 24th of January 2010, I published an article which will forever haunt me, but it's good to remind oneself of one's frailties, where I said that the Arab world did not need revolutions, and that actually it was a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. And my reason for that, which I elaborate upon, was that Hosni Mubarak and others had destroyed civil society in Egypt and other places. And that it was unthinkable that were the state to become weakened or removed, that anything but complete and utter chaos could erupt. And I was definitely very fearful of that for the first few days of the uprising. I was never so glad to be wrong in my life as to remember the way that Egyptians showed the best of what it meant to be an Egyptian and the best of Egypt in that square. And I will never forget that an old man called Sheikh Ahmed Afat, may God have mercy on his soul, he said the first time that he saw Tahrir Square was the first time he saw Egypt. And that promise, I think, remains with some people today. And it's a promise that I intend to uphold for as long as I live.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today. I want to say a special thanks, and please give a round of applause to my good friend Steve Walter, who owns the Cutting Room, for allowing us to be here today. It was so generous of you, Steve, and we're so grateful to you. Thank you very much, Hisham Hellyer. Thank you so much for your time, and it was a fascinating conversation, as I knew it would be, so thank you for being here.
A round of applause for Holt, please.
Well, I didn't do very much. Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.